Welcome to De-Risky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz. For today's episode, we are talking about, what else? Tariffs. We try to make sense of the past weekend's flurry of tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, including why Trump ultimately hit pause on the Canada and Mexico tariffs while moving forward with the China ones.
You know, Geoff, with all these tariff actions, we may need to consider renaming our podcast. It doesn't feel very de-risky anymore, so are we now like decoupling business?
Yeah, I don't know. Wait, are there any good 1980s movies puns we can make about decoupling?
Maybe, or maybe we take one from the Gwyneth Paltrow playbook and go with conscious decoupling?
Maybe. I'm not quite sure how conscious this weekend's past actions were, but we'll see.
Well, in any case, the bottom line on all this tariff action is to be continued, as clearly this last week's tariff salvos were only a start. Listeners, as always, please reach out with comments, questions, or suggestions for movie pun-related titles for us at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. This podcast is supported by Amazon and general support to the CNAS Energy Economics and Security Program. Geoff, busy week for de-risky business listeners and observers in this space. Anything going on?
Yeah, it seems like this is the week the tariff threats got real, so let's dig into it.
Did they get real, though?
Well, maybe we'll come back to that question.
Yeah, we'll come back to that
question. The threats got real, so we'll see. Yeah.
We'll circle back on that question. Well, to start, for folks who may have been living under a rock, perhaps we will quickly recap what has been going on in the tariff space. So I will also note that we are recording this on Thursday, February 6th. It's a very fluid situation. So if you're listening to this podcast in a couple of days, it could be entirely different once again. But what we know now is this. So over the weekend, President Trump started to make good on tariff threats that he has been floating since the campaign period of imposing 25% across the board tariffs on Canada and Mexico and 10% tariffs on China, purportedly to address concerns related to the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigration from all three of those countries. Potentially the theory of the case here was to try to use the tariff threats to kind of really put pressure on those governments to take action for what is, admittedly a very serious problem in the United States. Fentanyl is a huge issue. We haven't been able to crack this. It's responsible for usually the leading cause of death for young Americans right now. So huge problem. But we can get into whether this was the right way to get at this particular problem.
Yeah, exactly. There's sort of a bit of an outstanding question. Is fentanyl the real motivation? Is this a kind of legal predicate to declare an emergency and then take action Trump wants to take anyways? But anyways, so we have kind of the Saturday night big announcement of the tariffs are coming, and then a sort of few days of panic, I can say, sort of certainly in Mexico and Canada, which ultimately ended up with some kind of negotiated drawback or a pause at least for 30 days for both Canada and Mexico. So the Canada-Mexico tariffs, as we are recording right now, are on pause for the next 30 days until early March. Meanwhile, the 10% tariffs on China have gone into effect.
That's right. And I think to understand the motivation behind the tariff imposition or threats, and particularly how the various governments responded, it's worth going through country by country because the underlying facts are very different for each country. And then the responses that we saw to the governments that were being targeted was also very different. And so let's just walk through that quickly. Let's start with Canada. And it was the tariffs on Canada that really seemed to spark the most outrage for a couple of reasons. Of course, Canada is a close security partner. We have a significant trading relationship with Canada, but also Canada is just not a source of fentanyl coming into the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's the real big issue, that there does not seem to be any evidence that suggests Canada is a major source of fentanyl. Again, the kind of stated rationale for these big 25% tariffs. Again, this is, coming from the U.S. DEA itself. These are sort of, the U.S. security assessment of the issue suggests Canada is not a major source of fentanyl. So it's hard to really see the rationale here.
That's right. And to use a stat that we've seen floating around quite a bit, Canada accounts for about 0.2% of all fentanyl seizures at the borders. To put that in a different perspective, 43 pounds of fentanyl were seized at the northern border as opposed to 22,000 pounds overall. So it's just, as a factual matter, we're just not getting a lot of fentanyl from Canada. Nonetheless, what we saw from Justin Trudeau and the Canadian government was an effort to at least appear to be responding to the concerns, right? So they announced, recommitment to a massive amount of funding for border security. They created a new fentanyl czar, kind of continuing with the process of commitments and promises that they've made to President Trump, dating back to, in the transition period where these tariffs were initially floated and Justin Trudeau immediately got on a plane and had dinner with President-elect at the time, Trump, at Mar-a-Lago to try to tamp down some of the concerns.
Yeah, exactly. The Canadians seem to be, the strategy of being very responsive to what Trump is asking for here. Again, I think, so far the asks have all been kind of relatively small costs on the Canadian side, sort of, increased border security that they were already planning to do. The sort of, new fentanyl czar, we'll see what impact, if any, that actually has. Probably not huge. But, at least for the moment, Canada has sort of kept the threat at bay for another 30 days.
That's right. And part of the Canadian response, in addition to upping its cooperation, upping its commitments related to fentanyl and border security, of course, was that they did come up with their own retaliation. And I think of the three countries that we've seen in this tariff dispute so far, Canada did have the clearest and strongest hit back. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Currently, as listeners maybe know, there's sort of a lot of sort of separate political drama going on in Canada right now. There's the midst of a kind of leadership race amongst the Liberal Party to figure out who will be the next prime minister. And I also think understanding that sort of as soon as that person is in place, there likely be a new national election to select a new prime minister. But what's really notable is that sort of across this very divided political system, there's sort of wide support and consensus on the view that we need to hit back. We need to have kind of dollar for dollar tariff retaliation. We have the list of products ready to go on which we will be imposing tariffs on U.S. imports coming into Canada. And I think, the sort of combination of preparing strong retaliation while also doing everything they can to be responsive to Trump's demands seems to be where the Canadians are landing on this.
That's right. And I think Chrystia Freeland, who recently resigned from Justin Trudeau's government in part because of her concerns that Trudeau was not preparing for a trade war and tariffs adequately, she came out and explicitly called the tariffs an act of economic warfare, right? So, I mean, safe to say the Canadians were pretty pissed. You were in Canada.
Yeah.
What was the vibe there?
Yeah. So as it turns out, I sort of happened to be in Canada over the weekend for a workshop this past Monday on economic security cooperation between the U.S. and Canada. Sort of either fortuitous or bad timing to talk about U.S.-Canada cooperation, depending on your point of view, maybe. But no, I mean the vibes were very strong, and again, sort of both at the expert level of everybody who was following this closely, but I was really surprised just how big a national issue this was. Every cab driver, every waiter, this was top of mind for them. They are booing the U.S. national anthem at sporting events in Canada. Like, it was a widespread and very kind of strong and emotional response to the kind of U.S. bullying in their perception on these issues.
It does seem like part of that response has been just sheer confusion at what the U.S. was trying to accomplish, right? I mean, as we said, the stated rationale, the rationale that's in the legal executive order, was about fentanyl. Canadians know there's not a fentanyl issue. And then you have the rhetoric of public officials in the United States talking about this, where they're talking about 8 to 10 different other issues that aren't in the executive order. And so I think the Canadians were just like angry, but also kind of baffled. Like, what do you actually want? Yeah,
exactly. The reporting seems to suggest, the Canadians have been sort of looking to the sort of Trump team for a while now, trying to figure out, all right, tell us what you actually want, and then we'll sort of figure out how we want to respond to it. Again, there's kind of the fentanyl set of issues, which, seems to not really be here nor there. But then there's also kind of Trump going on Truth Social saying the real issue is the trade balance and sort of deficits there. Kind of Canada is screwing us economically generally. So there's a lot of questions about, where are the real pressure points and what's actually kind of driving this broader policy.
Yeah, one of the comments that I thought was particularly illuminating, before there was the announcement of the pause on the tariffs on Canada, you had Kevin Hassett, who was one of Trump's primary economic advisors, who said, Canadians appear to have misunderstood the plain language of the executive order, and they're interpreting it as a trade war. And I will say, when I first read that comment in the reporting, I was like, well, I don't know. I mean, the plain language says fentanyl and 25% tariffs on a major trading partner sure seems like a trade war. But then when I thought about it a little bit more, it was like, is this a signal to the Canadians that like, no, you are misunderstanding what we're trying to do here. Like, just give us a win. This is about our domestic political audience. We want to show that we're being tough on fentanyl, broadly speaking. And so if you give us something here, this is all going to be rolled back. And so I actually think that's the plain language of the executive order that the administration was really getting at, was help us out here. This is theater.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe there's some similarities with the Colombia tariffs that we discussed last week, I think, where there's kind of a very quick to escalate to very high levels, but then with relatively minor policy changes, kind of both sides can back down and de-escalate a little bit. That seems to be the playbook that we're seeing over and over here.
So let's move to Mexico. Now, Mexico also was threatened with these 25% tariffs, again, over fentanyl and migration. There's a little bit more of a there, which we should acknowledge, right? In terms of actual problems.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, we do have some real evidence that there sort of is an issue of fentanyl coming across the southern border from Mexico into the United States. This is kind of a shared bipartisan issue that's come up a lot recently. Again, looking at kind of the Drug Enforcement Agency's assessments, they do see that, kind of drug cartels in Mexico are bringing fentanyl into the United States. This is, part of the big, broader kind of U.S. domestic concerns on fentanyl. And we've seen the U.S. kind of taking actions here, including through the use of sanctions over the last sort of 3 or 4 years.
That's right. When we actually pulled the sanctions number, or I should say our lovely team of Eleanor and Kyle pulled the sanctions numbers for this, and you really see kind of a ramp up in the use of financial sanctions, specifically targeting the Mexican drug cartels for fentanyl-related issues over the last couple of years. And so in some respects, okay, we've used coercive economic statecraft tools to try to get at this problem. It doesn't seem to be working. And so like if you squint hard enough, you can almost see a logic in this response to Mexico, but it also seems like a little bit of an overreach. And then when you look at the outcome, they got the same outcome as Canada. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, right, the sort of fundamental question here is we are trying to kind of push the Mexican government to do more about fentanyl. Not a kind of completely crazy U.S. policy to do here. That said, the Mexican government does seem to be taking actions here, kind of, has been taking actions in recent years. I think, the Sheinbaum administration there has sort of tried to signal very seriously, again, both to kind of the last administration and certainly to Trump and his team, that they do take this seriously, are kind of investing in the anti-cartel issues, investing in kind of enforcement at the border issues. Do the tariffs make that cooperation more or less likely? I think is a question we should have. I'm not convinced that there's sort of that much more that we can kind of squeeze out of the Mexican government by kind of threatening these quite dramatic economic sanctions on them.
Yeah, and it's worth pausing on this point about the economic impact. It's true for Canada, it's true for Mexico, that 25% tariffs would be really, really difficult for them to absorb. I mean, you can talk about some of the trade numbers. For example, 80% of Mexican exports go to the United States. The United States is the primary source of foreign direct investment in Mexico. You've got supply chains that are highly integrated across Mexico, the United States, and Canada. So, for example, auto production, you've got not just cars that are crossing borders, but the parts and components that go into the cars that are crossing borders multiple times. And so I think one thing that's important to emphasize about the potential impact of tariffs like this is that it's going to hit those sorts of finished products a bunch of times as those parts and components go across borders. And so you're not just talking about potentially a price increase, which could be significant, but like actually a really more crippling blow to some of these really integrated supply chains.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the point. Again, when you think about 25% is a very high tariff rate. Again, from many of these products, the tariffs are sort of effectively zero at the moment. So that's a giant price change introduced on very short timelines. I think what we would have seen if these had actually come into effect, wouldn't have just been kind of, all right, how do we measure out kind of the price changes and sort of, track the production changes through there, but really just been kind of chaos in these, highly integrated global production supply chains. And I think you would have seen all kinds of companies that end up saying, at these tariff rates, it actually doesn't make sense for us to operate. We're just going to, stop trading, stop production. And so you would have seen economic impacts that frankly could have looked more like a kind of COVID shock where you're seeing, the random product on the shelves is not there because we hadn't really realized that it relied on a part from Canada that they've decided to no longer trade.
Yeah, I mean, take the auto example again. It's not easy to switch those supply chains, right? I mean, these are design cycles that are multiple years long. Once a car is designed, it has to go through safety testing. They can't turn these supply chains on a dime. It's also worth pointing out that the tariff regime that was initially proposed was highly inflexible, right? So there were no exceptions contemplated, no exclusions, none of those kind of safeguards that you typically have seen baked into a tariff program to kind of address and contemplate some of these real economic difficulties. And so maybe that would have come if these tariffs have stuck. Maybe that still will come if tariffs do stick in the future, right? But I do think it's worth just emphasizing, like, the reason that there was such a freak out from industry is because, like, this would have had potentially a shutdown effect in some industries.
Yes, exactly. And I think, certainly in Mexico, I think you're talking about a recession if this comes into place, likely in Canada as well, and a very big, significant impact in the United States. We shouldn't pretend this will be sort of only an impact on trading partners. This would have a large kind of destabilizing effect on many U.S. supply chains.
Okay, so we've avoided it for now. So we saw Mexican President Sheinbaum agreed to, among other things, rush 10,000 more troops to the border expressly to deal with the fentanyl and migration issues. She seemed to take a slightly different approach from Trudeau in Canada, though, in that, presumably they had their retaliation list ready, but that didn't seem to be a big part of her messaging.
Yeah, they weren't kind of leaning in as much on the "we will hit you back" piece. Again, we should say, we're in this sort of 30-day pause now, so maybe we're kind of doing this all again 30 days from now, and I'm sure that message will come at some point, if and when sort of tariffs are actually imposed. But it does seem, both Canada and Mexico, I think, are trying to ultimately sort of de-escalate things here and avoid any further trade wars.
So speaking of trade wars, let's talk about China. Now, it's so interesting kind of how this played out with China. So kind of a first distinction that's worth noting is that the threatened and now imposed tariffs on China were only 10%. And so just to take the fentanyl argument at face value, although as we've been talking about, there's lots of reasons why that is not the only thing going on with any of these countries, and particularly with China. But like, China is actually a source of fentanyl precursors. There have been sanctions against Chinese entities as well for their role in the fentanyl trade. This was a big area of focus for former President Biden's engagements with Chinese leader Xi to try to get some more robust cooperation going on. It was actually one of the few areas where it did seem like there was some small positive steps under the last administration in the bilateral engagement. So yeah, there is actually a problem with China when it comes to fentanyl. But then it's only 10% tariffs.
Yeah. I mean, that to me is one of the big puzzles here, which is that if you are really trying to kind of get Chinese attention and sort of force them to act here, the tariff seems kind of low, which is not something we say about the Trump administration very often, right? But like, this is a surprisingly small tariff, actually.
Yeah, I mean, worth noting, against a different baseline, right? So going into this, the average tariff rate was something around, 12%. But even if you add 12 and 10, that is still less than 25. I mean, we're not economists, but I could probably do that math. And so that is interesting. So what do you think is going on there? Like, why did they start lower?
So, look, I don't have any kind of particular insights to this. I do think it's notable that, I think Trump has come out and described these tariffs as an opening salvo. And so it does suspect this is maybe, one initial move and there will be kind of further escalation. I think, on the campaign trail, I think this, figure of 60% tariffs on China is still floating out there. And certainly the America First Trade Policy memo that we talked about in previous podcasts, there's still kind of other trains in motion for additional tariffs on China. So I suspect that is happening. I think the other question is maybe is part of this longer game of realizing they didn't want to rock the boat that much with China at this stage, at least.
I think that's right. I also wonder if part of this is perhaps an assessment that of the three countries, that it was going to be the tariffs on China that might actually stick, right? I mean, I think who knows, right? This is rank speculation. But there could have been a calculus that Canada and Mexico were likely to come to a deal. And so you could threaten the high tariffs, but you knew you weren't really going to have to live with the consequences. But with China, what we've seen, at least so far, as of the date of this recording, is that there's not a deal in the offing here, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe there was a sense that they might actually have to live with these tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. For Canada and Mexico, this was sort of existential question. They are sort of deeply, deeply dependent on the United States market. For China, and again, the economic impact here will be large, but obviously not nearly the same as what Canada and Mexico were facing. So kind of China was going to be less likely to come to the table and make concessions and give the Trump administration an early win here. So it does seem maybe they've structured them in a way that we can live with the cost if we go through with it. And again, which sort of up until now we are.
One of the details of the China tariffs that we should talk about is, it was true in all of them, but it will be particularly relevant in the China case, is the elimination of de minimis. Now, this is a debate that's been going on for a while. De minimis exceptions allow for smaller value packages to come into the United States without facing tariff rates. Basically, the argument has been it's just not worth customs time and energy to try to inspect and collect tariffs on these. It actually costs more to do that than the tariff revenue you get from that inspection. It's come up in the fentanyl context of maybe this is a route for fentanyl to come into the United States. It is also very much tied up in broader concerns around China and trade issues with massive Chinese e-commerce retailers, et cetera, availing themselves of de minimis. So this one's been a boiling debate for a while.
Yeah. And again, just to add there, I think there is a real issue here to be discussed. So a lot of the sort of early kind of logic and rationale around de minimis is things sort of individuals sending goods to themselves, kind of small one-off purchases where, we weren't not actually talking about kind of fundamental trade policy, and it didn't make sense to kind of, again, be trying to kind of calculate the right tariffs to impose on kind of grandmothers sending their children gifts across borders. But with the big rise of e-commerce platforms, it actually is a kind of economically fundamentally different world we are in now, with the sort of Shines and Temus of the world that are kind of making big moves into the US market. And again, kind of shipping directly to US final consumers under de minimis, meaning they sort of, would not be captured by any kind of tariffs on US imports from China. That is a sort of big open hole. Both there's sort of a set of security issues around kind of goods that are coming through this loophole, but also just thinking about kind of how do you rationalize trade policy. It's worth thinking, whatever set of tariffs we want to have on China generally, it probably makes sense that those should also apply to the Temu goods. Otherwise, why are we giving Temu a free pass here?
The de minimis change could be hugely impactful. 10% tariffs on China, 10% additional tariffs on China will be impactful. One thing that's been amazing to watch in this debate, though, is that there's been kind of this collective shrug. It was oh, well, we didn't have 25% tariffs on the North American market. So oh, wait, 10% tariffs on China? Nobody's really freaking out. Obviously, companies are looking at this from a supply chain perspective and they're assessing their own impacts. But it kind of seems at least in DC, the vibe I've been getting is people are it was going to happen anyways. Okay, here we are.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing. Sort of overnight, we effectively doubled our tariff rate on Chinese imports. And basically the kind of high level response has been well, at least the Canada and Mexico ones have been stayed for now. And sort of, I think there's some questions about if people think they'll ever come into effect. But it was a sort of massive change on US trade policy towards China that very much is flown under the radar. And again, it's very interesting thinking through, having spent some time in the Biden administration kind of previously, this is the type of policy that the Biden administration would have spent months and months internally debating and running 15 different cost assessments and everything, and would sort of struggle to come up with sort of any action on. It kind of really drives home the process differences between the two administrations, that this was sort of the kind of third afterthought piece of Trump's big tariff push on a Saturday night, and it's the one that's going to stick.
It's maybe an understatement to say that there's policy policy and process differences, but I won't dwell on that. Let's talk about China's response, right? So China's response has been relatively muted. We saw a statement from China's Foreign Affairs Ministry basically saying what we just were talking about, which is the US is going to do tariffs anyways, and it's kind of completely disconnected from any progress that China might make on fentanyl. So it does seem from the Chinese side, they're looking at this well, here we are, there was going to be tariffs. Yep. And that really affects the deal space here, right?
Yeah, exactly. A little bit, I think, where, Canada and Mexico kind of come in and say, all right, we'll willing to play the game, as it were, and sort of figure out, what do we need to give up that will not be too costly to us, that will sort of be enough to give Trump a win and kind of take off these tariffs. China's sort of saying, we're not playing this game, at least for now, right? That we are sort of not going to engage in the sort of small little back and forth here. We have kind of priced in increasing tariffs, as it were, whether they are coming for fentanyl or some other reason, this is what we are expecting, and we'll kind of build it in. And it's interesting to see that, at least for now, kind of have not really, seem to be not escalating at all. Their response has been relatively muted, and we sort of get into a little bit of what they are actually doing, and are just trying to kind of, keep their powder dry a little bit maybe, and sort of understanding there's more moves to come in this game.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so let's talk about what they did do, right? So they did file litigation at the WTO, which obviously
upholding the international rules-based order, as we know, China's the champion of.
Exactly, right? And so does the Trump administration care about WTO litigation? Like, no, they do not. Yeah. But it is absolutely part of China's messaging strategy with the rest of the world. It's that the U.S. is the one who's breaking the rules-based order, and China is here to uphold it, which of course is like ridiculous. Yeah. But filing that litigation at the WTO is definitely a thumb in the eye.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of, the United States in this vision is the kind of revisionist power that is trying to sort of upend everything, and China's here to maintain the great multilateral cooperation and rules-based order that they've always believed in, of course.
That's right. Yeah, of course. And then the other responses that we've seen from China are kind of like a mixed methods response, right? Like, so they did, they have in previous instances done kind of tit for tat tariff retaliation. We're seeing a little bit of a broader toolkit here, right? So they are kind of going to one of their kind of now go-to moves of putting more restrictions on exports of critical minerals over which they have dominance. We're starting to see, just another example of an antitrust investigation on a major U.S. company with operations, in this case, Google, right? So this is very much their toolkit of like, they know where they have leverage. They're going to respond in a couple of different areas just to remind the United States that actually we have weaknesses too.
Yeah, exactly. And it does seem, from the moves they're making, they're not really trying to impose big costs in the United States at this stage, but they are sort of signaling their awareness and kind of willingness to use this broader toolkit in a kind of trade war scenario, and very much, as you say, kind of reminding policymakers in the United States and elsewhere that China has cards to play here too. One thing that I do think will be interesting as these kind of tariff games play out more broadly is how much other countries will also look to sort of move away a little bit from the kind of tariff for tariff retaliation to a broader, more kind of power politics pose here, figure out, all right, where are the actual sort of asymmetric leverages that different countries have, and will we kind of play those cards? Again, I think, being up in Canada over the weekend, there was sort of some discussion of like, actually, we do have some, more impactful, disruptive cards we could play that would be, again, a bit more sort of blowing up the system a little bit, that they are, certainly not willing to officially be talking about yet, but I'm sure those discussions are happening in many different countries right now.
So let's talk about how this all plays out, right? I mean, I think fair to say that this is, in the president's own words, an opening salvo across many fronts. We are 2 weeks in a 4-year term, right? Like, this is not the last time this particular game is going to be played. So where do you think this goes with, let's start with China.
Yeah, so again, certainly this is sort of move one of a many move game. Lots of other kind of balls in the air with China. There's the sort of outstanding TikTok question, which sort of the Chinese government will probably at least have some power to either sort of approve or block a potential deal. And I do think kind of Trump is serious about wanting to get a TikTok deal done. So that's, moving on its own timeline of a couple of months out at the moment. And then obviously there's just sort of a much broader kind of looming US-China trade war, trade reset, whatever you want to call it. Again, I think there are many kind of folks in the Trump administration who are more committed to this idea of a US-China economic decoupling and very happy to push the sort of real longer-term 6% tariffs, whatever it takes, to really unwind some of those supply chains. So there's definitely many more cards to be played there. Again, does that end with some type of negotiated deal? Does that negotiated deal lead to more integration, or is it a negotiated deal that actually kind of solidifies more of the decoupling? Lots to see there, but I'm sure there will be more to come on the China front.
And let's talk about what's next for Canada and Mexico. Maybe worth doing a little bit of a callback to our original Tariff Tarot round that we played when we were talking about how do we think about these tariff threats as they started to come up in the campaign and the transition period. Do you remember what cards we played?
I think we had the bluster card and the high impact card, which seems pretty accurate, right?
I think that's basically where we are, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's a lot of bluster. It's potentially, I mean, not potentially, it would be hugely impactful. But it's still kind of hard to tell how serious the actual imposition of tariffs, like how serious that threat is, right? So we're in this 30-day stay period, and it's just fundamentally unclear. Like, once we get to that 30-day mark, is Justin Trudeau going to have to get on a plane again? Like, is this just going to be like a continual renegotiation, or is this going to settle into a little bit more of an equilibrium?
Yeah, I will say the analogy I heard from a Canadian colleague at this conference I was at last week, and keeping in mind this is a family-friendly show, but use the analogy of a game of strip poker, which is that sort of every round you need sort of something you can take off. So you need sort of some little concession you can give to the Trump team, and you want to kind of play strategically to stay as covered as you possibly can be through each round. So it does seem, the kind of fentanyl czar is taking off a sock or whatever it would be. And we're going to kind of go through these rounds to figure out kind of how much does Canada need to give up each time, and what are the sort of, more performative maybe actions they can take before they start having real economic or political costs.
Well, thank God this is a podcast, and and we will spare our listeners any more extension of that metaphor. The bigger picture question, though, when it comes to Canada and Mexico, of course, is USMCA renegotiation, right? I mean, like, this is obviously going to have an impact on that. There's all these questions around whether the 25% tariffs was just kind of, increasing U.S. negotiating leverage. I mean, who knows, right? But like, unquestionably, it's going to color the negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it's really interesting because I think it cuts both ways. So part of it is very much Trump, I think, trying to gain leverage in advance of those negotiations, trying to say, like, we will seriously impose real costs here. We know that, Canada and Mexico are more dependent on the United States than vice versa. And so kind of, will therefore be pressured to make concessions in these negotiations. But obviously the other piece of it, and again, it's something I heard a lot when I was in Ottawa, is that, these types of threats do bring up real questions of, over the long term, should Canada be rethinking the kind of security vulnerabilities that come from its deep dependence and integration on the United States. And this is a long-standing Canadian sort of economic and political question going back many, many decades. But if you go back to, even the sort of the pre-NAFTA precursor of the kind of initial Canada-US free trade agreement, there was, this question in Canada on, should we be aligning ourselves deeply with the United States, or should we be kind of looking for third options, other markets, and try and maintain more independence? Kind of foundational question to Canadian identity is sort of, how do they distinguish themselves from the United States? This type of tariff threat, and I mean, let alone the kind of 51st state comments and then all kinds of other things that we could bring in here, but are really sparking some kind of big picture strategic questions in Canada.
Hard to be frenemies with the United States these days, huh?
Yes.
Let's talk about litigation as well, right? I mean, so I do think there is a possibility at some point that some of this discussion and action moves to the courts. The underlying legal basis for the tariffs that were threatened and then imposed on China and threatened on everybody else was IEEPA, which we've talked about on the podcast before. So these are the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. They're supposed to be for, emergencies. And there's this outstanding question about whether IEEPA actually authorizes tariffs. And then there's a question about, can the president really just do whatever he wants under IEEPA? I mean, we've even said on this podcast, like, it's a fairly broad authority, it gives a lot of latitude to the president. And I think that is all still true. But at some point, I do think there is a real and an increasing chance now at this point that you're going to have companies in the US who, if some of these tariff actions really start biting the bottom line, they're going to feel like they have to sue. And I think that raises some really interesting questions around, well, can IEEPA be used for tariffs? It doesn't actually say tariff anywhere in IEEPA. And how broad is the president's authority to just call like anything an emergency?
Yeah, exactly. I think, that framing is exactly right. Where sort of IEEPA generally has been sort of interpreted very broadly. The courts have been very reluctant to sort of kind of overstep on the executive's authority here. But we should be clear, kind of IEEPA has never been used in this way before. And
Right.
so, you can kind of look to past precedent and say like, well, kind of the courts will let the president do what they want, but we should be clear, the president is using IEEPA in a way that has not been used before. And certainly I think there's, I fully believe there will be litigation at some point on this, whether sort of this is the moment or it'll be a coming tariff, we'll see. But it's probably a good opportunity for us to plug a colleague of ours, Peter Harrell's article in Lawfare that really kind of digs through all of the different legal issues surrounding the use of tariffs under IEEPA and points out, I think, quite convincingly that there are real, or at least should be real, constraints on this.
Yeah, and I think particularly around the tariffs on Canada, if I were a lawyer, which again I am not, I do think there's a vulnerability there in the government's stance on this, right? Because they're declaring an emergency on a fact basis that is non-existent. And then in the public commentary around the tariffs, they named about an infinity number of other reasons why they wanted Canada to do something, right? So that does seem arbitrary in a way that just isn't supposed to happen in the US legal system.
Yeah, exactly. And then maybe the other point to raise here is that it does seem, if the Trump team is serious about doing universal tariffs that would apply to kind of all countries, IEEPA may be the most straightforward legal path to those tariffs, but that's going to have huge questions and will be challenged in courts for sure.
So another question we've gotten, particularly from foreign government counterparts, is, oh my God, are we next? Yes. So, and how are you thinking about that question?
I mean, good question. Again, maybe the sort of first initial answer to always give is sort of anyone who claims they know what Trump's going to do next is giving you a lie. So who knows, right? But I think, we and many others are trying to think through a little bit. All right, we can look at, where are the countries that might be most exposed to this from a sort of bottom-up process? And you can say, countries that would be impacted by the reviews called for in the America First trade policy memo that the Trump team put out on the first day. I think you can look at countries that have, big deficits with the United States as being areas where there may be kind of come under pressure, come under the microscope a little bit. But then sort of separately, there's the, could be anyone at any time question, like a bit we saw with Colombia, I think, right? Where sort of there's now a very clear precedent that has been set that sort of any little bilateral spat, it seems the Trump team is not going to hesitate to kind of very quickly move to threatening, crippling tariffs. And so there's a real question of sort of how often will this game play out?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's going to be these two tracks where you kind of have this bottom up kind of almost normal policy development process that's going to be all these investigations under the trade authorities that are cited in the America First Trade Policy Review. And I think that's going to be serious business. And I think tariffs imposed under that process are credible and probably will stick, right? Yeah. I mean, and then you have what I've been calling like the ad hocery process, which is like the Colombia tariffs, arguably the Canada and Mexico tariffs. It's more theater, it's more for our own domestic political audiences. And that's going to be much more unpredictable. Curious your thoughts on like, do those tariffs stick? Like, obviously companies and countries have to worry about that. But if it really is just theater, like how much of those are actually going to be imposed? I mean,
that's the big question. That's the sort of maybe tariff tarot question we're going to be coming back to a lot over the next 4 years. I mean, look, I guess how I've been thinking about it, there's a sort of crying wolf analogy of sort of like always saying like, oh, we're about to impose tariff, not doing it. But it's worth remembering, the end of that fable is the wolf does actually show up at some point, right? And so, I do suspect we're going to see more, again, the kind of Canada-Mexico scenario is a bit different. That would have a huge cost on the United States. The Colombia case, I think, is an interesting one to look at where sort of, again, I think the Trump team could have carried through with those Colombia tariffs and it would have had sort of certain costs on, coffee producers and flour importers and maybe a few other sort of handful of industries, but ultimately would have been a manageable cost for the United States, but would have been devastating for Colombia. And I think that's the kind of fundamental asymmetry you have when you are the, world's consumer of last resort, that you can bandy these threats about pretty widely. And so, it's just going to see what are the issues where the Trump team kind of chooses to play this card, and what are the countries that decide they're not going to back down on it?
Let's zoom out really far for a minute here too, right? So we've been talking about the tariff threats and credibility, but there's a broader foreign policy landscape that the United States is operating under. We've got these huge wonky questions around the structure of the trading system and how do we actually think about, our approach to trade in a geopolitical environment where actually we do want to discriminate pretty hard against some countries for legitimate security reasons, right?
Yeah.
And here I'm really thinking about China. And so how do you think about that broader strategic question of we actually have a lot of other stuff we need to get done?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, to kind of keep on going back to the America First Trade Policy memo, it makes very clear out front the Trump team is thinking about integrating national security and trade policy in ways that we have not traditionally done. The existing trade policy order that we live in either way, really kind of separates out these two things. Kind of says we have a set of rules based mostly around kind of integrating our economies, kind of promoting openness, quite critically really embracing this idea of non-discrimination among different trading partners, that we should treat all countries the same and have, again, what the trade lawyers call most favored nation tariffs that apply broadly. That I think, whatever you think of the Trump team, I think many people, including us, would say is not really fit for purpose for the world we live in. That the economic order can no longer treat national security as a small exception and say, there's a little escape clause if you are doing actions for national security, but that for the most part, those will not have real impacts on trade and investment flows, and the rules of the game, the kind of universal rules-based order, will be based around kind of lowering barriers to all countries equally.
Yeah, and we'll go ahead and flog some of our own work here. So Geoff and I had a piece come out in Foreign Affairs this morning. We'll link to it in the show notes, where we're basically talking about this broader geopolitical problem where you've got a geopolitical context that doesn't match our legal trading architecture. And so in the piece, we talk about how we can think about kind of a new construct of economic security agreements to get at this, right? How do we think about working with close partners to build common barriers against strategic adversaries like China, while also thinking about deepening market integration with close security partners, including Canada, right? And so to state the obvious, this just got harder, right? The US now has more of a credibility issue when it comes to negotiating those sorts of kind of creative, innovative ideas with close security partners. But to keep this zoomed out and over the long term, that's the direction the conversation around trade needs to go in, is economics and security are coming together. We need to come up with these frameworks to actually recognize that and think about how the US can have a more proactive vision to actually get at that problem.
Yeah, exactly. So, tons more in the Foreign Affairs article, and kind of encourage everyone to go read it. But I think, the heart of it is saying we should be treating our security partners much differently than we treat our adversaries, the sort of Chinas and Russias of the world, which, again, the US has been sort of moving in practice in this direction for a while, but the actual trading architecture has not kept up with that. And then we should also be thinking about, how do we really integrate all of the defensive economic toolkit of export controls, of investment screening, of sanctions, not treat those just as exceptions to a default presumption of openness, but actually build a regime that, understands the use of these tools and kind of integrates them into a rules-based order.
And part of that could be a change in our tariff policy, to be clear,
Yeah.
right? So to be very clear, we are not anti-tariff kind of as a knee-jerk matter, right? There are instances where tariffs actually could be quite helpful to achieve these sort of economic and national security objectives that we're talking about. And so targeted tariffs related to national security products, always subject to the specifics of the market you're working in and availability of products, and kind of if you put a tariff in place, does that actually achieve your policy objective? But there's definitely a place for tariffs in that conversation, but it's not 25% across the board tariffs on close security partners.
Yeah, I think that's the real challenge. I think, many of us in this broader community who sort of see some uses for tariffs, including people like Noah Smith, who had a really interesting article on kind of the benefit of targeted tariffs in some ways and how kind of broad tariffs can undermine that. Also including interesting Robert Lighthizer, who's in the New York Times this morning with sort of his view on kind of the use of tariffs in a new trade system. I think kind of there are real concerns that, some of these positive uses of tariffs that could be carried out by the Trump team, that's going to get kind of swamped by, bullying our close partners and allies using tariffs.
So the Ambassador Lighthizer article was fascinating, right? So he was the U.S. trade representative in the first Trump administration, was widely understood to be the architect of the president's current tariff plan, set aside the 25% tariffs that we've been talking about, but like kind of the broader strategic vision for tariffs. He's been a key critic of the trade deficits that the United States runs with other individual countries. And so it was actually really striking to see what seems like a veiled critique, a very polite and indirect kind of redirect, maybe is the way to frame his argument of like, great job, sir. We need to address fentanyl, applaud the creative use of tariffs in that context. But also let's remember that I had a vision for how tariffs were going to be used to address trade deficits and to encourage reindustrialization. And so like, let's keep focus on that. And so it's a little bit different than the argument that you and I had about defensive tools and tariffs and how to use them in a more strategic way. But like in some ways, it's kind of the same of like the international trading system is broken and let's keep focus on what the US can do to fix that, whether it's for, reindustrialization and trade deficits, which, I don't know that we see exactly eye to eye with Ambassador Lighthizer on, or for these security reasons, but like there's a bigger, longer term project that is going to be incredibly difficult. We can't lose sight of that.
Yeah, exactly. This is like a big, sort of a generational effort almost to sort of reorient a lot of the trading system around these different priorities, in that, that long-term strategic vision. This is going back to other writing we've done on the need for economic security strategy, as well as the need for a roadmap for tariffs to kind of outline, what is the purpose that this administration is seeking to achieve when it implements its tariffs. And again, sort of, I think the overarching point is like nowhere in any of that does sort of shock 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico for what ultimately turned out to be like relatively small concessions fit into a bigger strategic picture.
All right. Well, now that we've turned the conversation into like something very nerdy about an international rules-based system, maybe that is a good place to call it for today, Geoff.
I think so. I'm sure we'll be back with more tariff talk soon.
Probably.
Thanks for listening to De-Risky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.